Okay, in this video we're going to talk about negative reinforcement and punishment. So remember the definition of negative reinforcement, right? The behavior in this case removes or prevents the occurrence of an aversive stimulus, right? So the negative part is removing or preventing an aversive stimulus, right? And because the aversive stimulus is terminated or prevented, that reinforces or strengthens the behavior in the future, right? So remember, Rosa was playing in the plant and I found that aversive. I went over to play with her to distract her. So my play removed that aversive stimulus and therefore reinforced my behavior. Made it more likely I would play with her when she started attacking the plant. There's two types, right? Escape and avoidance. So escape is when you actually feel the aversive stimulus versus avoidance where you can prevent it from happening altogether, right? So an escape, like a free operant situation, you press a lever to turn off a shock. So imagine an animal in an operant box, shock happens, you press the lever to turn it off. Discrete trial, shuttle boxes are used, right? You like jump over a barrier to escape the shock. Now avoidance, you need some other signal, conditioned stimulus, right? And the conditioned stimulus signals that a shock is coming, and then the animal can respond to prevent the aversive stimulus from being delivered, like the shock. So in a free operant situation, for example, a tone might come on a few seconds before a shock is delivered, and a bar press would turn off that shock or prevent it from happening. In a discrete trial, a signal happens like a light, and if the animal jumps, they can avoid the shock altogether, not be shocked. Now keep in mind that a conditioned stimulus could be the passage of time. So the CS here could be the passage of time, and this is what's called temporal conditioning, where CS is time. And a good example of this is Sidman avoidance. The researcher's name was Sidman, Sidmann, and he pioneered this, where he would put an animal on a shock schedule, and it has to be a consistent schedule. So like a shock 10-second schedule means every 10 seconds the animal will get shocked unless they jump over a barrier. So there's no external cue, but the passage of time serves as a cue. And what would happen is the animal would wait, 5, 6, 7 seconds, then jump to the other side, then wait 5, 6, 7 seconds on that side, then jump again, and avoid the shock by jumping every few seconds. And this would continue for many, many, many trials. So this is the Sidman avoidance, or an example of temporal conditioning. This is a very powerful form of learning. And Solomon shows this. So he did a number of studies involving negative reinforcement, but he did one that didn't end up published, but he talked about it. And what he did is he had his subjects were college male students, and they had an electrode hooked up to their leg. And so they came into the laboratory and they were told, given a demonstration electrical shock, and said, hey, if you don't respond, you're going to get this electrical shock. And what they did is they gave them a little panel, little light comes on, and they just turned a knob to respond and avoid this electrical shock. And Solomon hooked them up and gave them these instructions and observed their behavior and found he essentially put them on extinction, so he was never going to shock them. And this behavior would continue for thousands of trials, so it wouldn't extinguish. And the other thing that they recorded, they also recorded heart rate as well. And I'm going to come back to this. But this was the highest recorded heart rate in human beings, and so they had to discontinue the study because it was potentially dangerous. But in earlier versions, when they asked them why they were responding, they said they were going to avoid the shock. And so the experimenter promised that they wouldn't be shocked, but people continued to respond. The experimenter unplugged the machine, but they still continued to respond. The experimenter then took the electrode off the leg, so it's not possible for them to be shocked. They continued to respond. Eventually, they took the control panel away, and the subjects did not like that. So what does this show you? This shows you that these, even though they weren't going to shock them, that they would continue to respond for many, many, many trials just because of the fear of responding. And what this shows us is that avoidance is very powerful. It's really hard to extinguish because how do you know when there's been a change in the contingency, right? It's not obvious. You're responding to prevent something from happening, so you'll keep responding just to prevent that horrible thing from happening. We all know people who respond very heavily or heavily motivated by avoidance. Maybe you are even one of these people that's heavily motivated by avoidance. But how do you know that the contingencies have changed or haven't changed? Now, this leads us to the avoidance paradox. This was a real problem for learning theorists. Remember, they didn't like to talk about what was happening inside the black box, and so they had a hard time describing or explaining what gets learned when there was no consequence. Think about it. You have your behavior, like you're pressing a bar or something like that, and the outcome or the consequence is nothing. So that was a problem. Now, it's not a problem if you think about that heart rate recording and you look inside the black box. What's happening is anxiety is increasing, right? You have your signal, your conditioned stimulus, and your anxiety is increasing. And then when you behave to avoid the shock, your anxiety decreases or goes down and is relieved. So if you look inside the black box, you can actually find out what's happening. But this is where that basic learning perspective that was espoused by Skinner and Watson and others sort of falls flat because you need to have some sort of mental event that sort of explains what's going on here for the avoidance paradox. But that's what's going on there. So let's talk a little bit about punishment. Remember the definition for punishment here? Behavior produces an aversive stimulus. So sometimes people call this positive punishment. So behavior produces an aversive stimulus, or we could talk about negative consequences, something aversive. So does punishment work for changing behavior? The answer is yes, it does work. It is effective in changing behavior. Remember all four of those cells that we talked about before, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, and omission all change behavior, but there's certain factors that are needed to have effective punishment. And the first one is the level of the punisher. And what I mean here is punisher, we're using the term to refer to the aversive stimulus itself. So the punishing stimulus should be as intense as possible. So the punishing stimulus should not be introduced in a mild form and gradually increased. It should be introduced at its maximum threshold that you're comfortable administering. Now, why is this? Well, animals and people will habituate to mild punishers. That means that they get sort of used to these low level shocks, and if you gradually increase it, they just take more and more of the shock, and punishment is not as effective. It really has to be, the punisher really has to be strong enough to completely suppress the behavior the first time. If it's not, if it's in a mild form, it's not going to be effective. The other factor that you have to have is the delay between the response and the aversive stimulus has to be as short as possible. Now, the reason for this is, remember, you're trying to note a relationship between the behavior and the consequence, in this case, the aversive stimulus. With really long delays, it's hard to associate a particular behavior with the delivery of that aversive stimulus. So what you really want to do is have a short time interval between that. Otherwise, let's say that a dog chews a sofa and you come home after work. If it's been many hours since the dog chewed the sofa and you start trying to punish your dog for chewing the sofa, it's not going to know what it's being punished for. In fact, it might even associate being punished with like coming to greet you at the door, something like that. Lots of behaviors can happen in between the time in which the response happened and the aversive stimulus is delivered. So to have the most effective punishment, it has to come right while the behavior is happening would be great. The last thing is the punishment should be certain, high contingency. That means that every time the behavior happens, it is followed by the aversive stimulus. It's punished. Because if it isn't, what's happening is the behavior is being positively reinforced or non-punished instances, right? So remember Thorndike's law of effect, right? The behaviors are going to persist because there's some sort of reinforcing contingency. So we engage in stuff that's reinforcing, and so there's a reason that it's there. So if you're trying to punish or decrease a behavior, it has to always follow. Otherwise, you're fighting against this force of strengthening behavior, of like positive reinforcement. It's being reinforced in some way. So let's talk a little bit about, is punishment practical to change behavior? And let's consider our system of justice, right? Our court system, law, legal system. Are our judgments fast? What about the delay? And hopefully you're shaking your head. No, judgments aren't fast. Oftentimes there's many, many months, sometimes years in between when the person got caught for the crime and when a sentence is delivered. What about the level of punishment? It usually starts out for light punishers, right? First for first offenses, and then it gradually gets higher, right? And is it certain? That means, do we have a high contingency? Often, no. People often engage in these criminal behaviors many times before they actually get caught. So our system is set up to be punitive in nature, but it doesn't follow any of these rules to actually change behavior. So you have to wonder what it does or why it even exists. So what alternatives do we have if we can't use punish? Well, actually, I should say, let's talk for a second. Is it practical to use to change behavior for children? Well, it can be very difficult to do, right? And there's also some negative consequences for using Punisher. Not only do you have to have these things in place, but you could, if you're using punishment, you can often teach them to engage in more violent behaviors that can happen. And so it's sort of undesirable for parenting or for even training of animals to use punishment. So what alternatives do we have? Well, we have a lot of alternatives actually that we can use. One thing that we could do is we could punish the target behavior and use alternatives, right? So you could redirect or reinforce other behavior when possible. So I'll give you an example with Rosa. So when I was trying to break her habit of attacking the plants, I used lots of things. So I used extinction first of all. I wasn't going to play with her when she went over to attack the plants. I put her on extinction, and I saw that extinction burst. She jumped into the plant. The other thing I decided to do was play with her when she was behaving, when she wasn't attacking the plant. That's what she was seeking to begin with. So pick random times and start playing with her so that she wouldn't necessarily have to attack the plant to get playtime. So I reinforced other behavior. Then the other thing I did is I figured out a way to punish her for attacking the plant. And with cats, a lot of times you can use a spray bottle with water. It doesn't really hurt them. They find it aversive. And you just basically squirt them with the water when they go over to the plant. And it's also good because they don't associate you with the punishment. They associate the punishment with the spray bottle itself. So that's one example of using multiple things that were alternatives, but also including punishment. Another example is one time when my son was really young, he would hang on the furniture, which can be dangerous. He could break something. He could also hurt himself. And so my wife very cleverly found something that he could hang on that was safe. And so, like, you're not going to stop the hanging behavior. He had a reason that he wanted to do that. So you redirect it to when it's appropriate. Another good example is he also got involved in karate, and boys do lots of things like kicking and punching. And so karate was really good because you have a socially acceptable time where you can kick and punch, and you learn when you can do that. So you're redirecting the behavior not to you or siblings or whatever, but to in karate class. Other examples, if a child is like stealing money, find out what the motivation is. Are there things that they want they don't have the money for? You should that behavior should not go unpunished in some sort of way, but you could also give them a way to earn money to try to prevent that behavior from happening in the future. Dogs chewing things. Dogs are going to chew. You can't punish that out of them. That's just part of their genetic makeup is to chew things. But what you can do is have lots of alternatives. Teach them what to chew. allow them to discriminate, right? Give them lots of toys. We have lots of Tank chew toys all around the house. He's never chewed anything of our furniture or shoes or anything like that because he has lots of alternatives and he's learned what he's allowed to chew, and he plays with his toys. The other things that we can do is we can use timeout. We can use emission training, right? But if you're going to do this, you have to eliminate the opportunity for positive reinforcement. That's where a lot of people make a mistake. We also use 1 minute per year of age. So if you have a 2-year-old child, use a timeout limit of 2 minutes and you set a timer. Give some clear contingencies, explain to them why they're going into timeout, try to catch them in the act, that kind of thing. The other thing that you can use for alternatives to punishment is use extinction. Stop rewarding undesirable behavior. This can be hard, particularly when you're talking about tantrums and things like that. And I know you've seen the Super Nanny episode, but that's what you have to do, and keep putting them back into timeout, for example. So those are a lot of the alternatives that we have. This is an example. This is just a funny Far Side cartoon that sort of demonstrates the principle that you want to have a short delay between the behavior and the punisher delivery, right? So he says, catch him in the act or I'll never learn. So that's what that's referring to in the form of punishment.